Alright, YouTube, I was looking through the videos of another user earlier, and one of their videos gave me an excellent idea of something that I actually hadn't covered, probably should have covered this years ago. A video on the difference between how, an, uh, not just Abrahamists, specifically Christian, to a lesser extent Judaistic or Islamic person, the difference between how they would react to something like, in a philosophical way, to spousal abuse, child abuse, generally being a violent or drunken asshole, something like that. The difference between how they would respond and how somebody from a satanic or a more pagan philosophy would respond, sort of the differences between these two major groups. And of course, the subgroups are different. They have different views on such things. But generally, they're in line with each other. Abrahamism has more, there's more similarity between these different religious groups within the Abrahamic path than there is differences. Just like with Satanism and paganism, they're not remotely the same thing, but their philosophies are far more similar to one another. And I think sometimes even the Satanists and pagans themselves don't really realize how similar these philosophies actually are when you think about the actual written texts about what their philosophies believe, their religious or philosophical backgrounds. One of the reasons that the world is so plagued with abuse, one of the reasons why this is the case, is in the Western world, the Islamic world especially, to an even greater extent, to a lesser extent, but still in a harmful way, the Christian world and the Jewish world, child abuse is seen as okay. And I say that because to me, even spanking a child is a form of child abuse. There are more people that will disagree with me on this than will agree with me. There are even plenty of pagans and Satanists who will say that's not the case. I believe it is. I believe that any form of physical discipline, except for if you're restraining someone because they're, completely going apeshit and potentially hurting themselves, that's a different issue. Uh, Pushing somebody around, if they're already being aggressive, that could be a different issue too. You could debate that. But as far as spanking children, hitting them, taking a belt to them, these are behaviors that in the past were seen as acceptable, largely because of the spare the rod, spoil the child passage in the Bible. It doesn't actually impart any moral lessons on them. What it teaches the kid, and it's the same in spousal abuse cases, what it teaches them is violence is okay. It's okay to react with violence to another person, even if they're not themselves being violent, simply because you don't like what they said, or because you don't like what they believe, you don't like yada yada yada. The list goes on and on. In Christian households, you see parents. I've personally seen parents hitting their children because their children don't believe in God. It's abuse. Clearly, that if these same people in Christianity that believe that we have to go whole hog to get rid of abortion because a fetus is a sentient being, well then how much more is a child that's already cognating a sentient being and therefore endowed with the same right to believe what they want to believe, to say what they want to say, regardless of whether their usually worthless parents agree with it. It's purely psychological torture for them when they're not allowed to be who they actually are. And the fact is, that's because these same religious parents, especially Christians and Muslims, you don't see this as much in Jewish families, specifically in the Western world. I don't know about actual Israeli Jews. Jewish families, they tend to be more tolerant of these differences. You see, like, religious Jewish couples with gay kids all the time, and they never really seem to harass them, which is strange, but considering what their Bible says, what their part of the Talmud says, but that's a totally different issue. These Christian and so forth parents, it's not that they want to follow the Constitution or anything like that. Well, the Constitution lets me beat my kid over the head with a cane. No, it's because they want control. These people are pathologically paranoid. They have generally, the fundamentalists anyway, they're all mentally disabled or they wouldn't believe things the way that they do. Do I believe we should label it a mental instability? No, but I believe we should passively accept the fact that some of these people are truly lunatics. They want to control their children because they have a pathological fear of hell. and it drives them to try to control others' actions. They've been raised in such a world that they think that that's what their existence means. They need to spread that view to other people, and especially their children. I've pointed it out before. I've seen it with my own eyes, experienced it myself. The more religious the family is, the more likely that their kids, as long as they have rudimentary access to the outside world, like they're not Amish or living in highly censored, Kuwait or something, as long as they have rudimentary access to other people's opinions, they will immediately abandon their faith the moment they turn 18. I've seen it before. I've seen, for instance, the one fundamentalist family I've mentioned before with 6 daughters in my church. I've spoken with 3 of their daughters now. They're all atheists. They do not believe in God. They abandoned Christianity the moment that they left their parents' side. The moment that they were able to get away from the church, they became non-believers. They were always non-believers to begin with, but then they could live openly. And they became all that more rebellious as a result of their parents' abuse towards them, and their parents did hit them. I don't believe that parents should do that at all. No, if you look, one specifically famous example in history was Alexander the Great, one of the most renowned people that's ever existed on the face of the earth, a brave warrior, conqueror, an excellent statesman, not so good at domestic organization, but he's obviously did quite well in his life until he apparently was either poisoned or drank himself into a fever and died. When his father wanted him to be educated, he never hit him. He would use logical discourse, actual philosophical discourse, to try to persuade Alexander how to act based on philosophy, based on logic. That's the way to go. You can more easily keep your kid from destroying themselves by, shooting heroin or something. You don't hit them for it. It's not going to convince them to do otherwise. Kids are going to rebel anyway. But if you teach them philosophical and logical discourse and persuade them rather than telling them what to do, they're actually more likely to do what you say. I've done this all the time with people. I don't go around telling people what to do. What I do is I set up a logical, structured argument as to why I think something that I think when they ask me questions, and generally they accept that. I'm not saying, well, Satan commands you. Well, I command you. Well, you're an idiot. That's not how you deal with people. You wouldn't deal with adults this way if you're sane and rational. If you were in a business and you were talking to people on a regular basis, you're a secretary, telemarketer, whatever the hell you are, if you start commanding other people and threatening them and acting aggressively towards them, they're not going to pay attention to you. In fact, they will more often do the exact opposite of what you say. This is something psychologically and logically that people in the Abrahamic path do not comprehend, because their religion, not originally, but during the largest part of its existence, was founded on the notion of forcing others into the belief. We have to slay the pagans and force them to believe what we want them to believe. Instead of using logic to tell people, well, or philosophical discourse, well, our way is correct or superior or whatever, or should be practiced because X, Y, Z. Instead, they just went in and they killed and raped a bunch of people and said, okay, now the rest of you will submit. You'll be good little Christians, otherwise we'll come and kill the rest of you. And this was the recipe for genocide throughout the entirety of the Dark Ages and into the Renaissance. The so-called enlightened era of the Renaissance was really a more technologically advanced, less miserable for the Christians version of the Dark Ages. It was miserable for everyone else because they started killing even more people because they had the means to do so. The Satanic sort of pagan view would be that philosophical discourse. Spousal abuse is even a different issue. If you're beating your spouse or something, and it could be a woman beating a man too, by the way, or it can be in a gay relationship or polyamorous or an orgy festival, anything like that, where adults are being aggressive towards the other person. The Satanic view, the Christians would tell you, and I've heard this on Christian radio all the time, well, you've got to learn to forgive your abuser, you've got to learn to cope with it. Obviously, they were possessed, is one excuse. They were imbalanced because they weren't a real Christian. They were going through something in their own life that gives them, if not an excuse, some sort of rationale behind the way they acted like they did. The Satanic or pagan view would be destroy them. If you're not able to physically destroy them, either they're a lot stronger. Obviously, you don't want to go to jail because you shot someone in the head. That wouldn't make any sense. Ritualistically destroying them is a psychological manifestation of your own rage. It's possible for the human mind to dump its emotions and externalize them and then forget about them to heal. Uh, one and it's the same principle. People go to anger management. They say, "Well, you're gonna box this little I don't even know what those fucking things in boxing are called that they, jab at." But they go there, they'll go to the gym, and they work their aggression out. They release it, they externalize it, and it makes them feel better. It gives them more self-control because they're learning to target their aggression towards an object which is not another person or something fragile in their home or their dog or something like that. Animal abuse and child abuse are the most heinous things you can possibly think of. You hear all the time about people drowning puppies or, abusing their dog or starving their cats or something. If it were up to me, these people would be hung. The same with people who abuse their children or their spouse. If it were up to me, they'd all be rounded up and shot. Unfortunately, we can't do that in this society. I don't think there's any place for it. I think the world would be better off without such people. But in the case of Satanism, because we can't simply execute these people, although it is always funny when one of them gets killed in self-defense, it's an instant chuckle for me because these people usually deserve it. Especially if someone's abusing their animals and then the animals turn around and attack and eat them or something. It's got to be the most hilarious thing in the world. I wish I could get footage of things like that happening because I would watch them over and over and beat off. But in Satanism, the idea is instead of turning your cheek and dealing with the abuse, and in some cases people psychologically they get even more messed up and they start blaming themselves because they're being abused. That's a purely Christian idea. If you were to go to some pagan village back in the Dark Ages, before the Christians went in and spoiled them, they probably already pilloried these people. People that they found morally offensive, they probably threw them in the Wickerman and burned them to ash. That's, I think, a more reasonable way of dealing with it. Of course, I don't think that the government should have the power of capital punishment, so it'd be left up to local vigilante groups. This is sort of a libertarian utopia idea. It's never actually going to happen and is admittedly untenable, but it would be a perfect world if we could do that. The satanic pagan perspective would simply be externalize that anger, go ahead and take it out on an inanimate object. Of course, the abusee often becomes an abuser later, which is something that people should avoid. If you're being abused, there's a higher chance that you will become abusive because you're psychologically scarred. Therapy can work. Therapy can be a good thing. But the philosophical perspective behind the satanic pagan perspective of it would be you don't need to suffer under it. If that abusive person's already out of the picture anyway, like you were abused by a parent, you were abused by a spouse, ex-spouse, or a sibling or a friend or something like that, so-called friend or something like that, externalize the anger and get rid of it. This is one of the founding concepts of what I am currently writing about on my third book, the idea of taking your emotion, negative emotions that are harming you in your life, and getting rid of them through a sort of symbolic externalization. If you feel guilty, you first tell yourself there's no reason to feel guilty, and then indulge in what makes you feel guilty, if it's safe to do so. Obviously, like, having sex with HIV-positive people or, shooting heroin is a different issue entirely. If you feel fearful, get rid of that unwanted fear through deliberately exposing yourself to what made you afraid, unless, again, it's dangerous to do so. Legitimate fear and legitimate guilt are totally different from the kind of guilt and fear created by Abrahamism in particular. You don't see that same sort of guilt complex going on among pagans and Satanists. Why? Because in paganism and Satanism, you're not made to feel guilty for all of these things. You're told to feel guilty or fearful for things that are logical, that are rational. It's fine to be afraid of lightning. What wouldn't make sense is to be afraid of crocodiles and you're living in Norway or something like that. Well, there you go. There's an apt comparison between the two kinds. Because the Bible mentioned, it didn't. I'm just trying to give a metaphor. But say there was a Bible passage that said crocodiles were evil and would drag you to hell if they ate you or something. That's the same thing. With abuse, it works the same way. You've got to learn to forget about that abuse, and the easiest way to do that is to symbolically externalize. It's already done in psychology. Anytime someone's taking anger management, well, it can work the same way for abuse. Uh, People should not have to suffer based on other people's actions. And then there are those, final point here, in Christianity especially, say, oh, well, those Satanists, they're always abusing kids and sacrificing animals, and the pagans and Wiccans do the same thing. They're carving them up and boiling them in their own blood, and then they smear it all over the... That doesn't happen. In one extremely funny case, and this was on the Geraldo Rivera devil worship Satan's Underground thing. Watch it. It's right there in the actual documentary, so-called. One of these satanic abuse cases that they point out was, oh, well, there was an evangelical minister who was abusing kids after some sort of Sunday class in the basement of the church, but he was actually a Satanist, and there were all these ritual things there that never actually existed and they never found. Here's an evangelical minister doing something bad to kids, and they blame Satanism for it. It has no basis whatsoever in reality. The reality is that these sexually starved, paranoid freaks that become megachurch pastors are a bunch of raging perverts. You look at Ted Haggard. Well, what was he doing? Oh, well, you can cure gayness. You can stop being gay. Come to my therapy center. Give me a couple $100 and I'll cure you of being gay. And it turns out he was getting sex from a male masseuse while he was smoking meth. This is the kind of idiot that runs a megachurch. And this has happened before. Look at that. There was that one dude in, I think, Atlanta. It had some weird gangster-sounding name, and he always wore gold chains and drove around in his, Cadillac and so forth. And he's embezzling money, and he's smoking pot, and he's having sex with parishioners. And there was a case, I think last year, at a different mega church, where a couple of interns at that church, 20-teen or 20-something interns, sort of like the younger, not elders, but interns at the church, were raping, female parishioners. This happens all the time. What you don't see are a bunch of pagans, actual pagans, not self-proclaimed, well, I worship the devil and I wear a Metallica shirt and play Led Zeppelin backwards. Those people aren't even involved in paganism and Satanism. They're a bunch of crazies. These people have more in common with Christians because they actually believe in a literal Christian devil, which you will find nobody in the left-hand path does. Very few of them anyway. You see it all the time in megachurches where kids or women or animals in some cases are being abused. Good pious Christians putting their dog on a barbecue or something. You never hear this happen among real Wiccan and pagan groups because they're well adjusted. They don't have all that guilt and fear. They don't have a bunch of paranoia complexes. They don't have a bunch of psychological problems because they've been drawn to that path because they are stable. They don't feel a need to put their imagined sins at the feet of some dead carpenter because they don't do those terrible things that Christians feel sorry for, and so they ask Jesus to forgive them. It's the same thing with priests. So many people enter the Catholic priesthood because they're pedophiles, or they're drug users, or they're rapists, and they say, well, maybe God can save me, and they become a priest. Once they become a priest, they're like, oh, well, thank goodness, this is a load off my back, but then they get those same images of fucking children or raping women or burning dogs or doing some other terrible thing, and they keep doing it. Only now they've got an excuse. They've got a shield because they can't be legally prosecuted in many cases because they keep getting shuttled around, and the church buries all the evidence of the abuse having occurred. No, all of these people that are being abused, look at it. Look at the priest scandals. Look at the Satanic Panic era and how it was actually evangelical ministers and pious Christian parents, so-called, that were abusing their kids and doing all of these weird things. These are the people with psychological complexes. The root difference between Christianity, Islam, and all that shit, and a good path like paganism or Satanism or various Wicca would be in there, that you term Wicca a form of paganism if you wanted to. The difference is the Christians and the Abrahamists in general will tell you, feel guilty and praise God and try to find solace with a God that's not actually there and thus can't help you feel better. The Satanists and pagans tell you, make yourself feel better. Learn how to do that. Here's, a few skills of how you can do this. That's the difference. And no, you don't have to forgive your abuser. You shouldn't have to. They did wrong. If it were a perfect world, you'd be able to destroy them yourself, physically. Unfortunately, we can't do that, at least in the United States. I'm sure there are plenty of other countries that would be glad to turn a blind eye if you decided to shoot them in the head. In South America, people die all the time, get found in the gutter the next day, half-eaten by rats. Nobody cares. They just throw them in the river. So that's about all. I just thought I'd make this video because I was inspired to do so. No, nobody should, number one, at least from my perspective, and I know this speaks for at least some other pagans and Satanists, I'm former Satanist in my case, I believe that hitting your kid in any way is unacceptable. Hitting your spouse in any way is unacceptable. Hitting an animal in any way, I mean, if the animal's trying to eat you or something, you're being attacked by a bear, that's different. But people who like kick their dogs, throw their cats on the floor, I consider that completely ridiculous. It shouldn't be allowed. In a perfect world, these animals would then gain sentience and attack and kill them. Unfortunately, it's not. But at least people who have been abused, they do not have to forgive their abuser or any fun-sounding Jesus bullshit like that, because that's exactly what it is. It's the most hypocritical, nonsensical, backwards ideology you can possibly think of that these Christians propose. That's why their religion is dying. That's why people are now avoiding their religion, because it is bullshit. There is no Jehovah, and there is no Jesus. Jesus, if he existed, was a completely lunatic carpenter living 2,000 years ago, and scorpions are now residing in his rotten, decaying flesh, his mummified body sitting under several feet of sand out in the Judean desert, and those scorpions are having sex and laying eggs in his eye sockets right now, if indeed